Beneath the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean, a ghost sleeps. For 80 years, its secrets have lain buried under layers of ocean and official silence. But some truths are too powerful to stay hidden forever. This is not just the story of a ship. This is the story of 2 minutes that changed naval history forever. 2 minutes that transformed a mighty battleship into a tomb. 2 minutes that witnessed the single most shocking sinking of World War II. On a quiet afternoon in November 1941, the HMS Barham, a 31,000-ton giant of the Royal Navy, was sailing through these very waters. Then, without warning, catastrophe struck. In less time than it takes to make a cup of tea, this floating fortress was gone, taking 841 souls with her. Why did it happen so fast? What fatal flaw caused this mighty warship to vanish almost instantly? And what does this tragedy tell us about the brutal evolution of modern warfare? The answers lie in a haunting piece of film, in newly uncovered documents, and in the silent testimony of the wreck itself. This is a story of courage and sacrifice, of terrible secrets and heartbreaking losses. Join us as we dive deep into one of history's greatest naval mysteries. This is the full story of HMS Barham, the battleship that disappeared in 2 minutes. The sea is a keeper of endless secrets. For millennia, it has been a final resting place for dreams, ambitions, and entire chapters of history. The stories of those lost to its depths are often washed away by the relentless tides, leaving behind only fragments, whispers, and unanswerable questions. But sometimes, the sea offers a glimpse, a startlingly clear window into a single, catastrophic moment that defies all understanding. The story we begin today is born from one such moment-to-moment captured, not by historians, but by the cold, unblinking eye of war itself. This is the story of how a Colossus, one of the most powerful battleships in the world, a symbol of imperial strength, vanished from the face of the ocean in less time than it takes to brew a cup of tea. This is the story of His Majesty's ship, Barham. In November 1941, the HMS Barham was a leviathan of steel and fury, weighing 31,000 tons and stretching over 600 feet. She was a floating fortress. Her 8 15-inch guns could hurl massive shells across dozens of miles, and her thick armor belt was designed to withstand the worst punishment an enemy could dish out. She was not a relic. She was a frontline warrior of the British Mediterranean Fleet, a key player in a deadly game of chess against the Axis powers for control of the vital sea lanes between Europe and North Africa. Yet, on the afternoon of November 25, 1941, this immense warship, this home to over 1,000 men, simply disappeared. There was no epic, hour-long gun battle, no dramatic duel against an enemy surface fleet. The end came with a shocking, brutal swiftness. In the span of approximately 2 minutes, the Barham was struck, capsized, and torn apart by an internal cataclysm so violent it is still difficult to fathom. For decades, the full, horrifying truth was buried by the fog of war. Official reports were heavily censored. The details were classified. The families of the 841 men who perished that day were left with only vague explanations and a void of grief. But this mystery can be solved. Because, as I said, the sea gave us a window. A piece of film, originally intended for propaganda to showcase British resilience, instead became one of the most stark and terrifying records to emerge from the Second World War. It is a film that would be studied by naval architects for generations. A silent witness that forever changed how the world viewed the vulnerability of its greatest warships. Over the next journey, we will investigate the final hours of the HMS Barham. We will uncover the hidden design flaws that sealed her tragic fate. We will meet the men who served aboard her, and the commander of the German U-boat that fired the fatal torpedoes. Using modern animations and harrowing survivor accounts, we will deconstruct those 150 seconds of terror, piece by piece, to understand the precise chain of failure. And most importantly, we will remember the profound human cost. For behind the steel and the explosions, this is a story about the hundreds of men who lived, worked, and fought aboard this ship, and who faced an unimaginable end in the sun-drenched waters of the Mediterranean. This is more than a tale of a sinking. It is a story of shocking vulnerability, a desperate struggle for survival, and a ghostly legacy that rests on the seabed, waiting to be understood. Our investigation begins now, as we set out to unravel the mystery of the ghost ship that vanished before the world S. To understand the shock of its demise, we must first comprehend the sheer scale and power of the Barham. It was a product of its time, born from an era where naval dominance was measured in the weight of steel and the caliber of guns. The early 20th century was a crucible of global ambition, and the seas were the ultimate arena. The HMS Barham was a quintessential member of the Queen Elizabeth class of battleships. These were not merely ships, they were statements of imperial intent, laid down in February 1913, at the height of a frantic naval arms race. Her very conception was a response to rival powers building ever larger and more powerful warships. When she was finally launched into the cold waters of the River Clyde in December 1914, the world was already embroiled in the Great War. Her specifications were staggering for the time. Imagine a vessel longer than 2 football fields laid end to end. At her heart were 8 1/5-inch MiG guns arranged in 4 massive twin turrets. Each of these shells weighed nearly a ton. To support this formidable armament, she was protected by a sophisticated armor system, with a main belt of hardened steel over a foot thick in critical areas. She was powered by oil-fired boilers, a modern feature that gave her a top speed of around 24 knots. Making her one of the fastest capital ships of her day. But a ship is more than just its statistics. It is a floating city, a complex ecosystem of men and machinery. The Barham's crew numbered over 1,100 officers and ratings. They were engineers, gunners, cooks, medics, and deckhands. They lived in a strictly hierarchical world, where the clang of the ship's bell dictated the rhythm of the day. From dawn-up spirits for the rum ration, to the haunting sound of the bosun pipe signaling drills and duties. For over 2 decades after her commissioning, the Barham was a symbol of the Pax Britannica on the high seas. She patrolled distant waters, a mobile projection of power. She underwent modernizations between the wars. New anti-aircraft guns were fitted, and her superstructure was updated, but at her core, she remained a design from the previous generation. This is a critical point to grasp. By 1941, the Barham was a veteran. She had served with distinction in the Great War, including the infamous Battle of Jutland. But naval technology had advanced rapidly. The era of the aircraft carrier was dawning, and the battleship's supremacy was being challenged. Yet, the Royal Navy, stretched thin across the globe, relied on its battle-hardened veterans. The Barham was still considered a powerful instrument of war, but she was no longer the cutting edge. She was a titan, yes, but a titan with weaknesses that were not fully understood. Her armor distribution, while impressive for its time, was designed to counter the threats of the previous war. Her underwater defenses, a key concern against the growing menace of submarine warfare, were based on theories that had yet to be tested in the crucible of a new, desperate conflict. So, as World War II erupted, the Barham was called upon once more. She was sent to the Mediterranean, a cauldron of naval conflict. She was a familiar, respected, and formidable presence. To her crew, she was home a stronghold of steel that had weathered storms and history. They trusted her structure, her strength, her resilience. They could not have known that the very design that made her a colossus also made her vulnerable to a new kind of threat lurking in the deep. The lessons of the past were about to collide with the brutal realities of the present, and the Barham would be at the center of that catastrophic convergence. The stage was set. The veteran warrior was on the front line, but the rules of the game had changed. By late 1941, the Mediterranean Sea was less a body of water and more a lit fuse. It had become the strategic centerpiece of a brutal struggle for supremacy between the Allies and the Axis. Control of these azure waters meant controlling the vital supply lines that fed the forces of both sides in the scorching North African theater. For the British, holding the line was a matter of survival. Their primary mission was twofold: protect the crucial sea lane through the Suez Canal, the lifeline to their oil reserves in the Middle East, and their empire in East, and prevent the Italian fleet from joining forces with the German Navy, which could have turned the tide of the entire war at sea. It was a high-stakes game, and the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet was stretched perilously thin. The British faced a formidable adversary in the Italian Regia Marina, a modern fleet with capable battleships and fast-moving cruisers. But there was a more insidious, invisible threat that cast a longer shadow. The German U-boat was the wolf of the sea. Unlike surface ships that could be seen and tracked, these submarines operated in the shadows, Their greatest weapon was stealth. They could lie in wait along known shipping routes, their periscopes barely breaking the surface, waiting for a target to stray into their killing zone. It was in this tense arena that our two opposing forces were destined to meet. On one side was the HMS Barham, a symbol of traditional naval power, a surface titan, built for broadsides and line-upside combat. On the other was the German submarine, U-331, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Friedrich von Friederichta Sutiesenhausen. He was a skilled and calculating His command, U-331, was a Type V U-boat, the workhorse of the German submarine fleet. It was a vessel of a completely different philosophy. Small, stealthy, and designed for a single, devastating strike. It carried 14 torpedoes, each capable of delivering a crippling blow to a ship many times its size. In late November 1941, the Barham was part of Force K, a British task force operating out of Alexandria, tasked with intercepting Italian convoys supplying Field Marshal Rommel S. Afrika Corps. The mission on November 25th was no different from many others, a routine sweep into the eastern Mediterranean. Meanwhile, U-331 was on its fourth war patrol, prowling the same waters, its crew tense and alert. They were hunters, listening for the distant drone of propeller shafts, searching for the silhouette of an enemy warship against the horizon. Neither crew knew of the other's precise location, yet the intricate dance of war was drawing them inexorably closer. The British commanders, aware of the U-boat threat, zigzagged their ships and deployed a screen of destroyers, the shepherds protecting the flock. But the Mediterranean is a vast sea, and the U-boats were needles in a watery haystack. The Barham, for all its imposing strength, was operating in the U-boat's natural habitat. It was a game of battleship versus barnacle, of a giant trying to swat a nearly invisible foe. The U-boat's strategy relied on patience, precision, and a healthy dose of luck. It needed to slip past the destroyer screen, get within point-blank range, and fire its spread of torpedoes before being detected and depth-charged into oblivion. On that fateful afternoon, as the Barham steamed steadily, its crew going about their duties, the hunters were preparing to become the hunt. The fuse was burning shorter with each passing minute. The Mediterranean was indeed a powder keg, and a single spark was about to ignite it. The Mediterranean afternoon presented a picture of deceptive tranquility. The British task force, with Barham at its heart, steamed steadily about 100 miles west of Alexandria. On the battleship's decks, sailors went about their routines with the weary familiarity of men who had spent too long at war. Some scanned the horizons for enemy aircraft, others performed maintenance on the massive 15-inch guns. While below decks, engineers monitored the mighty engines that propelled this 31,000-ton fortress through the calm waters. The threat of war felt distant, abstract, something that might come from the air or from another ship on the horizon. 100 feet below the surface, in the claustrophobic confines of U-331, the atmosphere crackled with tension. Capit N. Lieutenant Hans-Dietrich Freiherr von Tissenhausen had achieved what few U-boat commanders dared hope for. He had slipped undetected through the British destroyer screen. Through his periscope, he watched the magnificent sight of a Queen Elizabeth-class battleship moving perfectly into his firing solution. The Barham presented a target so massive it seemed impossible to miss. Inside the submarine, the air hung thick with sweat and anticipation. The crew moved with practiced silence, each man understanding that their lives depended on perfect execution. The only sounds were the hum of electrical systems and the soft clicks of instruments. Tissenhausen's face remained impassive as he made his calculations, but every man aboard knew they were moments from either glory or death. The mathematics of destruction were simple. 3 torpedoes set to run at optimum depth, their electric motors leaving no telltale bubble trail. U-331 had become the ultimate predator, invisible, silent, and lethal. Tissenhausen gave the order in a calm, measured tone. Torpedoes loss aboard Barham. Warning came too late. A sharp-eyed lookout might have spotted the faint streaks approaching the port side, but by then, Evasive action was impossible. The massive battleship turned too slowly, its great mass becoming its greatest liability. In those final seconds, the difference between peace and catastrophe narrowed to the few hundred yards separating the running torpedoes from their target. The hunters had become the hunted. The invisible threat that naval planners had theorized about in quiet offices had materialized with brutal efficiency. The Mediterranean's blue waters, so calm moments before, were about to erupt in a cataclysm that would change naval warfare forever. For the men aboard the HMS Barham, the world ended not with a warning, but with a sudden, violent combustion. The first torpedo struck the port side amidships. The sound was not merely loud, it was a physical entity, a deep, metallic roar that tore through the ship's skeleton. It was the sound of the sea itself being forced through steel plating, followed immediately by the secondary thunder of the warhead's explosive charge. The massive hull shuddered as if it had been struck by a giant's hammer. Before the crew could even process the first impact, the second torpedo hit, and then the third in quick succession. The blows were perfectly placed, ripping open the ship's side in a line of catastrophic wounds. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The ship, which moments before had been steaming steadily, was dealt a mortal blow. It staggered, then began an immediate and terrifying list to port. The deck, once a stable platform, became a steeply sloping hill. Men who were standing were thrown violently against bulkheads or sent sliding across the now tilted deck. Unsecured equipment cells, tools, furniture broke loose and became deadly projectiles, crashing through compartments. The lights flickered and died, plunging the interior of the ship into a darkness broken only by emergency battery lamps that cast long, frantic shadows. The roar of inrushing water was overwhelming, a torrential sound that drowned out shouts and screams. Water, cold and relentless, exploded through the torn compartments, trapping men instantly. For those on the upper decks, the sight was one of surreal horror. The horizon tilted at an impossible angle. The sea was no longer beside them. It was rising up to meet them, racing up the port side as the ship continued to heel over. The air filled with the shouts of officers trying to organize a response, the cries of the injured, and the desperate klaxons of alarm bells that were quickly silenced as power failed. There was no time for a coordinated abandonment. The ship's list was so rapid and so severe that many watertight doors below decks could not be closed, and lifeboats on the port side were already submerged or hanging uselessly, while those on the starboard side were swinging out over the water at an impossible angle to launch. The unthinkable had happened. In less than a minute, the proud battleship had been transformed from a symbol of invincible power into a dying, crippled beast, rolling onto its side as the Mediterranean Sea poured into its guts. The 2 minutes that would decide the fate of over 1,000 men had begun. The clock was ticking, and it was ticking fast. The initial torpedo strikes were devastating, but they did not beat Tim Silva's doom, the HMS Barham. What followed was a chain reaction of failures, a perfect storm of physics, design, and fate that would unfold with terrifying precision over the next 2.5 minutes. This was not a simple sinking, it was an irreversible, mechanical unraveling. The first critical failure was the massive breach in the ship's portside armor belt. The 3 torpedoes had torn open a gaping wound, allowing thousands of tons of water to flood into the boiler rooms and adjacent compartments almost instantly. As seawater rushed in on one side, the ship's natural buoyancy was violently compromised. The sheer weight of the water pulled the port side down, creating the severe and immediate list that made any coordinated damage control impossible. But the true catalyst for the catastrophe lay deep within the ship. The magazines, the HMS Barham, like all major warships of her era, stored enormous quantities of high-explosive propellant charges for her massive 15-inch guns. These magazines were positioned low in the ship for stability and were protected by sophistication but now critically tested watertight compartments and flash protection systems. As the ship listed further and further to port, reaching an angle of nearly 40 degrees within the first minute, a new and terrifying danger emerged. The severe tilt caused a critical shift in the ship's internal balance. Equipment, machinery, and even bulkheads that were designed to withstand vertical pressures were now subjected to lateral stresses for which they were not prepared. The chain of events leading to the final cataclysm likely began in the flooded boiler rooms. Seawater, at a temperature far lower than the blistering heat of the engineering spaces, came into contact with superheated machinery and steam lines. The resulting thermal shock and pressure fluctuations would have been immense, potentially causing secondary explosions or rupturing steam pipes deep inside the hull. This created an environment of chaos and destruction below decks that prevented any crew from reaching critical stations to counterflood or isolate the damage. Meanwhile, the increasing angle of the list presented an even more direct threat to the magazines. Safety protocols required that magazines be flooded in extremis to prevent explosion, but the speed of the capsize, combined with the loss of power and the inability of crew to reach the flooding controls, made this safety measure impossible to execute. The high explosive shells and cordite charges, now tilted at a radical angle, were left vulnerable. At approximately the 2-minute mark, the ship had listed to an estimated 70 to 80 degrees. The starboard side of the hull was nearly vertical in the water. It was at this precise moment that the inevitable occurred. A spark, likely from shifting electrical equipment, arcing cables, or friction from collapsing internal structures, found its way to the exposed propellant charges in one of the 15-inch magazines. The result was an explosion of almost nuclear ferocity. The entire aft section of the Barham ceased to exist in a microsecond. A fireball of incandescent gas and fragmented steel erupted from the heart of the ship, tearing the massive vessel in two. The force of the detonation was so immense that it was felt on nearby ships and registered on seismographs in distant ports. A massive column of smoke and debris shot hundreds of feet into the air, and a shockwave radiated outward, killing men in the water and rocking the escorting vessels. This internal explosion was the final, definitive act. It was not the torpedoes that sent the Barham to the bottom. It was the subsequent detonation of her own munitions. The 152nd catastrophe was a textbook example of a ship's defensive strength becoming its ultimate weakness. The very armor that was meant to protect her trapped the explosive force, and the immense firepower she carried became the instrument of her instantaneous destruction. The sea did not swallow the Barham. She was vaporized from within. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, the full horror of the event was a closely guarded secret. The Admiralty, reeling from the loss and fearing a devastating blow to public morale, issued a terse and censored communiqué. For the families of the 861 lost men, the official story was one of a brave ship lost in a fierce action. The terrifying truth remained buried in classified files and in the memories of the traumatized survivors. But the sea had already given up its witness. And ironically, it was the Royal Navy itself that had captured it. On the bridge of the battleship HMS Valiant, which was steaming in formation alongside the Barham, a cameraman was present. His assignment was routine: to gather footage for British newsreels. Those short films shown in cinemas to boost public spirit and demonstrate the Navy's strength and resolve. He was there to film the fleet in action, a symbol of British power. When the torpedoes struck, his camera kept rolling. What he captured, almost by chance, became one of the most chilling and historically significant pieces of footage to emerge from the Second World War. The film is stark, grainy, and silent. Before the narrators who would later be added for public release, it begins with a deceptively normal scene. The Barham steaming serenely. Then, the first sign of Trebla's sudden, violent shudder, and the ship immediately begins its rapid, sickening list to port. The camera remains focused, almost unbelievably steady, as the colossal warship continues to roll over. Tiny figures of men can be seen scrambling on the steeply angled decks, some sliding helplessly into the sea. The most horrific moment comes near the end, as the ship lies almost completely on its side, its hull exposed. A massive, blinding flash erupts from within its belly. A colossal plume of dark smoke billows upward, and the sea around the ship is violently disturbed by the shockwave. It is the detonation of the magazine, a moment of pure annihilation captured from a distance of less than 1,000 yards. The British government understood the footage's power, but instead of suppressing it entirely, they used it in a carefully controlled way. Months after the sinking, a censored version was released to the public as part of a newsreel titled "The Sinking of HMS Barham." The narration, in the typically plucky and resolute tone of wartime propaganda, focused on the bravery of the crew and the swift rescue efforts by other ships. The catastrophic magazine explosion was described as the ship blowing up after being struck by enemy torpedoes, glossing over the shocking speed and totality of the disaster. For the public, it was a dramatic piece of war news. For naval experts and historians, however, it was a terrifying data source. The footage provided irrefutable visual evidence of a capital ship's vulnerability to underwater attack, and, more importantly, the catastrophic risk of magazine explosion following a severe list. It was studied intensely, leading to urgent revisions in damage control procedures and magazine safety protocols across the Royal Navy. Today, stripped of its propagandistic narration, the footage stands as a raw and brutal testament. It is not a tribute to naval power, but a stark document of its fragility. It captures the exact moment a community of over 1,000 men was erased. The haunting silent film endures not as a celebration of war, but as a somber memorial to its human cost, a ghostly echo of a catastrophe that unfolded in just 150 seconds. The great plume of smoke and debris from HMS Barham's final explosion had barely settled when the desperate rescue effort began. The accompanying destroyers, their crews shaken to the core, immediately raced towards the oil-slicked, debris-choked water where the battleship had vanished. The sea was a horrifying sight. A vast stain of fuel oil covered the surface, and amidst it, the survivors fought for their lives. They were men brought to the brink of death by unimaginable forces. Many were terribly wounded, suffering from burns, shrapnel wounds, and broken limbs. All were coated in thick, viscous oil that clogged their mouths and nostrils, making every breath a struggle. The shock of the cold water was compounded by the psychological trauma of witnessing their ship, their home, and their comrades vanish in a cataclysm of fire and water. The destroyer's crews worked with frantic urgency, throwing nets and ropes over the side, hauling the living aboard. They scanned the water for any sign of life, pulling men from the wreckage. But for every survivor pulled to safety, there were many more who would never return. The sheer suddenness of the capsize and the violence of the magazine explosion had given most of the crew no chance. Of the approximately 1,200 men aboard the Barham that day, only 450 would survive. Back in Britain, the news was delivered with a heavy heart. The Admiralty's carefully worded announcement spoke of a great loss in a gallant fight, but the details were scarce. For the families of the crew, this ambiguity was a special kind of torture. In the days and weeks that followed, telegrams began to arrive at homes across the country. For some, it brought the devastating news that a son, husband, or father was lost at sea. For others, an agonizing wait for information began, clinging to the fragile hope that their loved one was among the survivors being cared for in a foreign port. The impact on the tight-knit communities that had sent their men to sea was profound. The Barham had sailors from all over Britain, and her loss left a scar on countless towns and villages. The Admiralty's decision to release the censored newsreel footage meant that families and the public were shown a sanitized version of the disaster. The full horrific speed of the sinking remained a secret, known only to the survivors and the High Command. For those 450 who lived, the return was not a happy homecoming. They were ghosts haunted by the memories of those 150 seconds. They had seen friends swallowed by the sea, heard the final screams cut short by the explosion, and felt the horrifying helplessness as their world turned upside down. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as profound post-traumatic stress, carrying the invisible wounds of that day for the rest of their lives. The human cost of the Barham's loss was not just a number, 841. It was the quiet anguish of a mother who would never see her son again, the empty chair at the dinner table, the children who would grow up without a father. It was this silent burden carried by the survivors, a brotherhood forged in trauma. The sea had claimed not just a ship, but a microcosm of a nation at war. The hulking mass of steel now resting on the seabed was a tomb, a permanent memorial to the men for whom the Mediterranean became a grave. The sinking of HMS Barham sent shockwaves through the British Admiralty that were far more profound than the torpedoes that had struck her hull. Into said tense atmosphere of naval command, the disaster was subjected to a cold, forensic analysis that looked past the initial shock to ask a critical question. How could such a catastrophe be prevented from ever happening again? The investigation revealed a series of hard truths that challenged the very design philosophy of the Royal Navy as capital ships. The first and most glaring lesson was about the torpedo's devastating effectiveness. It wasn't just that the Barham had been hit, it was the sheer scale of the damage from 3 torpedo strikes. The analysis confirmed that the underwater protection system's essentially layered compartments, designed to contain an explosion, were insufficient against multiple, well-placed hits. A warship's side was far more vulnerable than previously believed, but the most terrifying revelation was the cause of the cataclysmic magazine explosion. The rapid, severe listing of the ship had made it impossible for the crew to perform emergency flooding of the magazines, a critical safety procedure meant to prevent the very detonation that occurred. As the ship rolled, equipment and debris likely blocked escape routes and damage control stations, while the drastic angle itself made moving through the ship almost impossible. The very systems designed to save the ship had become death traps in a high-speed capsized. The Admiralty acted with urgent resolve. A top-secret directive, known as an immediate order, was issued to the entire fleet. It mandated critical, immediate changes to magazine safety protocols. The most important of these was the mandatory fitting of a new system. A local remote control panel located deep within the ship's protected citadel, allowing for the rapid flooding of magazines from a central, damage-resistant location, even if the rest of the ship was crippled. The order emphasized that preventing a catastrophic explosion was an absolute priority, even if it meant deliberately sacrificing parts of the ship. Furthermore, damage control training was intensified dramatically. Sailors were drilled relentlessly on counter-flooding techniques to counteract a severe list, and procedures for fighting fires and managing flooding in chaotic conditions were standardized and practiced until they became second nature. The Barham's tragedy became a brutal but invaluable lesson in naval architecture. Her loss directly influenced the design of future British warships, with a renewed emphasis on enhanced underwater protection and redundancies. In critical safety systems, the knowledge gained was paid for in the lives of her crew, and it was a debt that would save countless other sailors in the brutal naval campaigns to come. Particularly in the Pacific theater, the legacy of the Barham was thus etched not only in the memories of those who mourned her, but in the very DNA of the warships that followed, ensuring that her sacrifice extended far beyond her own tragic fate. Today, the wreck of HMS Barham lies broken and silent on the seabed of the Mediterranean, a dark, cold monument to the events of November 25, 1941. The violent fury of her final moments has been replaced by the slow, patient work of the deep sea. Rusticles like iron icicles now drip from her shattered hull. Marine life anemones, corals, and schools of fishes claimed the metal fortress, weaving a tapestry of quiet life over the machinery of war. It is a peaceful, if haunting, final resting place. But to see the Barham only as a wreck is to miss the true meaning of her story. Her sinking was a pivotal moment, a brutal lesson written in steel and fire. It forced navies around the world to confront a new, unforgiving reality. The age of the battleship, the majestic Titan designed for long-range gun duels, was being challenged by the stealthy, lethal submarine and the dominant aircraft carrier. The Barham's destruction was a stark signal that the rules of naval warfare had changed irrevocably. The lessons learned from her loss about magazine safety, damage control, and underwater vulnerability undoubtedly saved other ships and thousands of lives in the ensuing years of the war. Yet, beyond the tactical analyses and historical significance, the most profound legacy of the Barham is human. The 841 men who perished were not mere statistics in a naval ledger. They were engineers who kept her engines running, gunners who manned her massive turrets, cooks who fed the crew, and young sailors on their first voyage. Te were songs. Husbands, brothers, and fathers from cities, towns, and villages across Britain and the Commonwealth. Their lives, their hopes, and their futures were extinguished in a terrifyingly short span of time. The haunting newsreel footage, the official reports, and the rusting wreck are all tangible evidence of the disaster. But the most enduring memorials are intangible. The family stories passed down through generations, the quiet pride mixed with enduring grief, and the collective memory of a sacrifice made in the dark days of a global conflict. The story of the Barham, then, is not just a tale of a sinking ship. It is a solemn reminder of the immense human cost of war, a testament to the fragility of even the most powerful machines, and a poignant lesson in the unforgiving nature of technological progress. As the ocean continues its slow work on the Barham's remains, the memory of the ship and her crew endures. It is a memory that calls not for glory, but for a permanent echo from the depths, urging us to remember the price paid for the lessons learned and to honor the lives lost in the turbulent waters of history.